Ready for a deep dive into a book that still sends shockwaves through how we understand, well, everything. We're tackling Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and let me tell you, this isn't just some dry science text. It's a book that rattled our sense of place in the world, and its ripples are still felt today.
And it's interesting how often Darwin gets painted with that lone genius's brush, like he just conjured up this radical theory out of thin air. But when you actually dig into On the Origin of Species, what you find is a whole different story.
Okay, now you've got me curious. So it wasn't a simple eureka moment with Darwin and a finch?
Not even close. The man was meticulous, borderline obsessed with the tiniest quirks of nature. Did you know he spent years dissecting barnacles? Barnacles. But all those barnacles, all those observations, they were building blocks helping him chip away at this huge question. What if species weren't these rigid, unchanging things everyone thought they were?
So he's seeing all these little variations and it makes him question the whole system. I can imagine that didn't go over so well back then.
Exactly. And to get his point across, Darwin uses something we can all relate to, dog breeding. Think about it. You've got a Chihuahua small enough to fit in your pocket, and then a Great Dane that can barely squeeze through a doorway. Same species, wildly different traits. And it's all because humans have been fiddling with selection, whether they meant to or not.
That's a perfect example. We don't always think about it, but we've been shaping the traits of plants and animals for millennia.
Precisely. Darwin calls this artificial selection, and he uses it to set the stage for his big idea, natural selection. If we can cause such dramatic changes in just a few generations, imagine what nature can do over eons.
Okay, so no divine intervention, no mystical forces, just nature calling the shots. That's a pretty big leap. But how does he actually explain this whole natural selection thing? Is it all just survival of the fittest, like most people say?
That phrase, it's really stuck around, hasn't it? Problem is, people often picture it as this brutal gladiatorial arena. But Darwin's struggle for existence, it's a lot more subtle than that. It's more about this constant pressure than some epic battle.
So not so much a winner-take-all arena, but more like a really intense game of musical chairs where the music never really stops.
Now, that is a fantastic way to put it. Imagine you've got a bunch of birds, and some have beaks, just slightly better suited to catching insects during a drought. They get a little more food, slightly better odds of surviving, maybe they raise a few more chicks. Now multiply those tiny advantages over thousands, millions of generations. That's when you start to see real change.
And that's natural selection at work. These small, almost invisible advantages, they add up over time.
Precisely. Those with advantageous traits are just slightly more likely to pass them on. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the best fit for your environment. And the truly mind-blowing part is that this constant pressure, this struggle, can eventually lead to entirely new species emerging.
Okay, so tiny variations, this constant pressure from the environment, and boom, you've got new species branching off. But if this has been happening for millions of years, shouldn't we be practically tripping over fossils of all those in-between creatures? Where are all the missing links?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Darwin's critics latched onto immediately. But, Darwin was remarkably prescient, because he actually dedicated a big chunk of his book to addressing the limitations of the fossil record.
So he was already anticipating that people would expect this complete picture, even though finding fossils is incredibly rare.
Exactly. He knew that fossilization itself was a long shot. I mean, most organisms just decompose, right? The conditions have to be absolutely perfect for fossilization to even happen. And even then, you've got erosion, geological events, all sorts of things that can wipe those fossils out.
It really makes you realize that the fossils we do have, they're like winning lottery tickets in the grand scheme of things.
Precisely. And yet, even with all those gaps, Darwin saw clues in what had been discovered. For example, he noticed that the older, deeper rock layers, they tended to hold simpler organisms, while the more recent layers closer to the surface revealed more complex life forms. To him, this pointed towards gradual change over these vast stretches of time.
So the fossil record, even though it's just snapshots, it still suggested this pattern of increasing complexity. I'm guessing his critics still weren't totally sold, though.
You're right, they weren't satisfied. They wanted more, especially when it came to explaining things like the eye. How could something so intricate, so seemingly perfect, how could that possibly have evolved through random mutations and gradual steps?
Yeah, that's a tough one to wrap your head around. It's hard to imagine an eye in progress being very useful.
That's exactly what Darwin's opponents argued. But Darwin countered by saying that even just a simple light-sensitive patch of skin, That could still give an organism an advantage, however small. Imagine an early sea creature that could just barely detect shadows, maybe just enough to evade a predator. That could be the difference between life and death.
That makes sense. It doesn't have to be perfect vision right away, just a tiny edge over the competition.
Exactly. Now, fast forward through countless generations, and those with slightly more sensitive patches, maybe with a slightly curved shape that helps focus light a little bit better, they're going to have a better chance of surviving and passing those traits on. And gradually, over eons, those tiny improvements could accumulate and lead to a complex image-forming eye.
It's kind of like how we talk about technology, right? Like the first computers, they took up entire rooms. But each iteration, each improvement, however small, it brought us closer to the smartphones we have in our pockets today.
What a fantastic analogy. And that's really what Darwin was doing with the natural world. He was drawing these parallels, showing how seemingly impossible leaps in complexity could actually be broken down into a series of smaller, more plausible steps.
So he tackles the fossil record, he explains these complex organs, and yet he still doesn't stop there. He goes headfirst into the evolution of instinct, which seems, if anything, even more baffling. Did he really think he could explain something like a bird building an intricate nest, all through this gradual process of natural selection?
He did, and it's honestly one of the most fascinating threads in his whole theory. Darwin was arguing that even behaviors, however intricate or seemingly hardwired, they could be shaped by these same forces of variation and selection that sculpted beaks and eyes.
But instincts, they feel so, I don't know, automatic, like they're programmed into an organism's DNA. How do you get from random behaviors to something like, say, a spider spinning a perfect web?
It all comes back to those two key words, variation and selection. Imagine you've got a spider ancestor that just randomly spins silk, maybe to protect its eggs. Now let's say some of its offspring inherit a mutation that makes that silk slightly stickier, better at trapping prey.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The ones with the stickier silk, they have a better chance of survival, they reproduce more, and over time, the web-building instinct, it becomes more and more refined.
Precisely. Those spiders with genes that predispose them to certain web-building behaviors, they're the ones that are going to thrive. Over time, the behaviors themselves, they become more complex, more specialized, until you get to something as intricate as the webs we see today.
It's just amazing to think that something as seemingly automatic as instinct, it could have arisen from this interplay of, well, essentially random chance and environmental pressure.
And that's the beauty of Darwin's work, isn't it? He took these grand mysteries of life, variation, adaptation, instinct, and he grounded them in a framework that was both elegant and testable.
So we've got this elegant framework, this testable theory for how life evolves, but I have to imagine not everyone was ready to just accept it, were they? I mean, it's one thing to study barnacles and finches, but to say that humans are related to apes, that's a whole different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. Darwin knew he was wading into a minefield of controversy. He even put off publishing on the origin of species for years because he knew the backlash was coming.
I can only imagine.
One of the biggest sticking points was this idea, really ingrained at the time, that everything in nature existed for a purpose, right? Designed by a divine hand.
Right, like the whole watchmaker analogy. You find a complex watch, you just assume there must be an intelligent watchmaker behind it.
Exactly. But Darwin's saying, hold on a minute. What if nature has a different way of creating complexity? What if it's not about a blueprint, but about this constant interplay of variation and selection?
And of course, that throws a wrench into the whole idea of humanity's special place in the universe.
It does. And it's interesting because Darwin even tackles the question of beauty in nature. He suggests that maybe, just maybe, beauty isn't necessarily there for our enjoyment, but as a byproduct of other adaptations.
Oh, those vibrant flowers we find so stunning, those could just be a happy accident in the grand scheme of evolution.
Exactly. Take those petals, maybe they evolved to attract pollinators, not to please the human eye.
It's humbling in a way, isn't it? To think that these aesthetic wonders we marvel at could have arisen from a totally different pressure than we assumed.
It is. And that actually brings us to another big point of contention back then, hybridization. Because hybrids, they were seen as kind of a taboo, right? Like nature's way of saying, don't cross the streams. They were thought to be sterile, a dead end.
So the lines between species were supposed to be nice and neat.
Right, but Darwin, he meticulously documented cases of fertile hybrids, blurring those lines even further.
So these categories we try to impose on nature, they start to break down the closer you look.
Exactly. Darwin was showing that nature doesn't always play by our rules. And maybe the most profound part of his whole legacy is this. He encourages us to see ourselves not as separate from nature, but as a part of this grand, interconnected web of life.
That's a powerful message, especially today, right? It's like Darwin saying, look, we're all in this together, humans, animals, plants, even those pesky bacteria.
And speaking of bacteria, Darwin's work has taken on a whole new level of urgency in the age of antibiotic resistance. Think about it. Just like those birds with slightly better beaks thrived in the drought, bacteria with mutations that help them survive antibiotics, they're spreading like wildfire.
It's evolution on fast forward, isn't it? Driven by our own actions, we're essentially selecting for the very bacteria we're trying to eliminate.
Exactly. It's this stark reminder that Darwin's insights aren't just confined to dusty textbooks or museum exhibits. They're playing out all around us right now in ways that affect us every single day.
Darwin's work, it was groundbreaking, controversial, and ultimately it's enduring, isn't it? It's a testament to this power of observation, to the importance of questioning, and honestly, to the sheer audacity of imagining a world where life itself is in constant flux.
And it's a journey that's far from over. Every new fossil we uncover, every genetic sequence we unravel, every intricate behavior we observe, it's another piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that Darwin helped us to even begin to understand.
And who knows what incredible discoveries await us down the line. I wonder, what would Darwin himself make of gene editing, artificial intelligence, the search for life beyond Earth? I bet he'd be utterly captivated.
I think you're right. He'd be diving headfirst into the data, eager to challenge our assumptions all over again.
That's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's a never-ending quest, a constant exploration of the universe and our place within it. And Darwin, with his curiosity and his revolutionary ideas, he set us on a path that continues to shape how we understand the world.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've done our deep dive into On the Origin of Species for today. We've explored Darwin's meticulous observations, those bold hypotheses, and the implications, both in his time and in our own.
We've seen how evolution, through this slow, steady pressure of natural selection, can shape even the tiniest details of life, from the shape of a beak to the complexity of an eye.
And as we've seen, we've really just scratched the surface. Darwin's legacy, it's not just some collection of facts and figures. It's an invitation to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, to never lose that sense of wonder about the natural world.
To keep marveling at the sheer ingenuity and resilience of life on Earth.
Absolutely. So next time you're out in the world, take a moment to appreciate that intricate dance of life unfolding all around you. Look for those subtle variations, think about the forces that shaped them, and remember the groundbreaking work of Charles Darwin, the man who dared to see the world through the lens of evolution.
And who opened our eyes to the interconnectedness of it all.
Until next time, keep your minds open, your curiosity piqued, and your sense of wonder alive.